the further you go back in time, the more intelligent the human species becomes. That is the correct narrative. So if you plug that in, that our antecedents were far more extraordinary than we give them credit for, and that there was a cataclysm. So you plug in the catastrophism and you understand that our antecedents were magnificently intelligent and physically robust. Then everything fits together. Everything we find, you don't have to obfuscate archaeological artifacts that don't fit the Darwinian uniformitarian paradigm of history, because that's what archaeologists do. I've seen them do it myself. I've witnessed this in Peru.
Hey guys, welcome to Menace the Menace. We've got a really cool episode for you today with a very special guest, Tim Alberino, and he's been very influential in the past couple of years of my journey into the, some would say fringe, but I think it's becoming more mainstream now. And Tim is an author. He's a filmmaker. He's what aren't you? You're a tour guide. You're a cigar aficionado, mustache enthusiast, all of the above. I'm sure I've missed some things, but all the accolades are bequeathed unto you, sir. Tim, one of the things that I've come across over and over again when listening to your content is your magnum opus, right? Your book, Birthright. Do you mind giving us just a brief little synopsis or overview of the book and where people can find it?
Well, I appreciate the kind words, especially I think, did you say I was a mustache enthusiast? Is that what you said?
Yes, sir. From one enthusiast to another.
I was going to say, it appears you are as well. Yes, that's the first time I've been referred to by that particular appellation. The book is Birthright. Very difficult people ask me to give a summary of this book, and it's very difficult for me to do that because I kind of bit off more than I could chew with the topics in the book. I span it begins in a pre-Adamic context, and then it works its way through the creation of mankind, the Genesis 6 affair, all that antediluvian content, and then I go through a bunch of topics related to the post-flood world, and then I talk about the what I call the alien threat, post-humanism, and I finish basically the crescendo of the book. It finishes in the terminus of the book, rather, is Armageddon. So it's very difficult to give you a quick synopsis of everything I discuss, but it's definitely a different view on some of these on these topics, certainly, but especially in regard to and I have a very unique eschatological view that incorporates the UFO phenomenon with post-humanism and a new religion that's coming, which I call apotheotheism. So it's eclectic, and I try and tie all these things together in a unifying narrative.
Okay. And if our followers know anything about me, everything you just said is right up my wheelhouse. And that's why Tim's here, is to discuss exactly these topics. And you were saying that the book's currently being recorded, or the audio is currently being recorded for the book. Yeah.
Yeah.
Where's that going to be, Tim?
I attempted to do an audio version myself, but I just never really had the time. So I've got a friend of mine who's a professional voiceover actor.
Cool.
Who's doing a phenomenal job, better than I could have done, for sure. So it's going to be really, really good, really nice to listen to. So that audio version, it is in the works. I don't know when it's going to be completed, but it'll be out this year for sure.
Okay, awesome.
So for those who've been asking me about an audio version. It is on its way.
Cool. And where can people get your book now?
On Amazon or online on the different book vendors like Barnes and Noble carry it online, not in the store, but on their website.
Okay, cool. And I'll put a link to that down in the description for those interested. All right, so we got an hour, man. Let's dive right into the deep end. All right.
All right.
So the first place I want to start is discussing the flood. Okay, and it's kind of unfortunate that to the non-Christian, the flood of Noah, right, as some call it, has become synonymous with like nut job Christianity. But nowadays, I think there's plenty of evidence coming out, and it's becoming more and more mainstream, that there absolutely was a cataclysmic event in human history that reset humanity. And we'll get into some of the biblical discussion or proofs on this. But for our followers that aren't Christian, I wanted to start with, do you have any extra biblical evidences for the flood?
Extra biblical in terms of other Dead Sea Scroll type material, or are you talking about the scientific theories?
I would say scientific theory. I would say archaeological evidence or geological evidence, even a lot of the myth and the lore outside of Christendom.
Sure. So in regard to the mythologies of the deluge, they're all over the world. Every major ancient culture had a cataclysm mythology, a tradition of a cataclysm that destroyed the earth and that nearly annihilated the human populace, the human population, save some group of people who were able to survive. This is ubiquitous all over the world. Sometimes the cataclysm is described specifically as a flood, quite often actually, as a deluge. Other times it's described as a great earthquake, volcanic eruptions, all kinds of different catastrophic events are present in the oral traditions and written records of, again, cultures all over the world. The North American Indians, the Aztec, the Maya, the Inca, that's just in the Americas. And in Europe, the same thing. You have flood myths in the Mediterranean, in the Fertile Crescent for sure, and that's probably where the traditions began. So there's no question that there's a record in the memory of mankind. There's a record of a cataclysm that, as I said, nearly extinguished the human species and rent the earth in dramatic fashion.
When do you think modern man kind of just decided, we're not going to believe all our ancient ancestors, all ancient civilizations? This is just something they made up, even though people were not in contact with one another and separated by, half a world away, and somehow they still all have the same or similar accounts of this.
Well, precisely because of these unified mythologies, deluge mythologies, it has always been assumed, or had been for a very long time, traditionally it's been assumed that such a cataclysm did occur. And more specifically, in the Western world, that cataclysm was referred to as the flood of Noah, the Noahic flood, which was primarily an aqueous cataclysm. And that was the way it was in the West. Geologists and scientists of all stripes simply assumed that the flood mythos was true, that there was truth to it. And it wasn't until the 18th century, probably the 19th century actually, when a geologist by the name of Charles Lyell published a very influential manuscript. I'm trying to remember the name of it. in which he proposed that there was, in fact, no cataclysm, that let me back up for a minute. So the prevailing view prior to Lyell's publication, prior to Charles Lyell, was what's called catastrophism.
Mm.
And catastrophism posits that the Earth has undergone tremendous cataclysms that have dramatically shaped the terrain, and that these catastrophes have been that we can interpret geological data in light of these catastrophes.
Mm.
When Lyell came along, he proposed a new theory called uniformitarianism, which is the opposite of catastrophism. And uniformitarianism posits that the changes that we see in geology, the geologic formations, that those changes happened very, very gradually over millions of years. So he rejected the notion of catastrophism, and he proposed that the same forces that we witness today, the very same mechanisms in nature that we see today, are the explanation for all of the geology that we have. In other words, that those same gradual forces that we see operating in nature, that's all that is necessary to explain the compendium of geology on planet Earth. And in order for that to be true, then Lyell required millions and millions of years of history, of geologic history, to have unfolded, because those forces are very slow. The change is gradual. It's very, very slow. Whereas catastrophism, the change is sudden, whether it be a deluge, whether it be a comet impact or some other kind of cataclysm, earth-rending cataclysm. That those kinds of changes are dramatic and instantaneous in some cases.
Right.
And so the doctrine changed, and Lyell's doctrine was readily adopted. And remember that there was another Charles who came on the heels of Charles Lyell, and that would be one Charles Darwin. Because the theory of evolution required eons of time to be rational, to make any logical sense. Evolution required the same kind of time as uniformitarianism. So Charles Lyell paved the road, so to speak, for Charles Darwin and his theory of evolution by natural selection. So that was the turning point when the scientific community and the culture at large the Western culture began to reject, slowly, it was gradual, began to turn away from the tradition of the Great Flood, and catastrophism, and the doctrine of catastrophism, and to begin to acquiesce to this new theory of uniformitarianism and evolution by natural selection. So that was the turning point. Now, it must be said that uniformitarianism and Darwin's theory of evolution do not conform to the oral traditions and written records of the human species on planet Earth. It does not conform.
Yeah.
The record of our species is cataclysm.
Right.
It's catastrophism. That's what we have recorded and remembered through our ancestors.
Right.
So if one subscribes to uniformitarianism, then one has to jettison all of this ancestral documentation, oral tradition,
Right.
the traditions of our ancestors, which I think is arrogant, quite frankly. I think very clearly something catastrophic happened in our past. Graham Hancock, the author and researcher Graham Hancock, he refers to this as our as an amnesia, that our species is suffering from sort of a collective amnesia, that we've forgotten something about our past, but all we remember is this cataclysm. And what was before the cataclysm is kind of cloudy, nebulous, and we have these great myths that come to us from the distant past, myths that talk about gods descending and cohabiting with the human species and the progeneration of their hybrid offspring, which in many cases are giants. We have these echoes coming to us from the distant past, and there's this, I call it a tombstone in the timeline of history that is was remembered collectively by the human race. That tombstone, of course, being this cataclysm that occurred and brought to ruin the old world. It absolutely and utterly destroyed the old world, and this was known. The Egyptians kept extensive records of this. The Greeks, the Romans, all of these different cultures around the world. Certainly the Persians and all of the Mesopotamian cultures had these flood mythos. These cataclysm mythologies, which in the Middle East always, almost in every case, the Mesopotamian lore involved a global deluge.
Right.
So I happen to believe that the root of all of these stories, the origin of these stories, is the original story, which was disseminated by Noah and his offspring after the aqueous cataclysm that destroyed at least the part of the earth that he was living in. And so it makes sense that all of these variegated mythologies would have a singular source, an origin story that they all shared. And some would contend, no, the origin story would have to be the Mesopotamian account with Utnapishtim, who's their Noah figure, and that whole account, because in terms of the literature, it predates the Bible. But that's assuming that the story predates the Hebrew account, which there's no reason to believe that whatsoever. If in fact, all of these flood mythologies around the world originated from the account that was disseminated by Noah and his offspring, then that oral tradition is the root of all other traditions.
So that is the oldest.
That would be the oldest, because they're the ones who came through the deluge.
Right. And then the biblical account or understanding is that Noah and his family reproduced after the flood. People began to multiply. And then there was the Tower of Babel event. Yes, everybody was one group until that point, right?
Yes, the origin of Mesopotamian culture, the origin of the Sumerians and the Akkadians would be Noah and his sons.
Right.
That would be the origin of that culture.
Yeah.
It's not the other way around. It wouldn't be that the Mesopotamian culture is the origin of the Hebrew culture, which, by the way, that is a true statement. But what I mean is, so let me rephrase that. The Mesopotamian culture is in fact the origin of the Hebrew culture, but it's not the origin of the Hebrew traditions. The Hebrew traditions would go back to Noah and the other pre-flood patriarchs. So that's an important distinction, because people are always going to say, wait a minute, doesn't the Sumerian account, for example, predate the biblical account? Well, it doesn't matter which piece of literature is older. What matters is what is the origin story.
Right.
If the origin story is in fact Noah and his sons, then that is the original story from which the Mesopotamian accounts, from which the Sumerians and the Akkadians and the Babylonians and the Egyptians are derived, from which their accounts are derived.
Yeah. That's a really, really good point, Tim, because one of the arguments against Christianity is we have just copied earlier religions, earlier texts, the cuneiform tablets, the Sumerian, the Anunnaki, all of those things. They just say that we have copied and changed and adapted what was older. But it sounds like you're saying, and correct me if I'm wrong, that actually the biblical account is the one that's the real narrative because it's the one that comes from Noah and his descendants who actually lived the events. And everybody else, like the Sumerians, the Egyptians, the Canaanites, the Babylonians, all of them weren't necessarily the ones keeping the true account. They might have been influenced by other forces.
Exactly right. They would have had a modified version. And in my view, the Hebrews, because remember, as I said before, this is an important distinction. We know that Hebrew culture came out of Mesopotamia because Abraham, who's the father of the Israelites, came out of Mesopotamia. So that was the Sumerian or Akkadian, depending on where the land of Ur was located. It could have been in either. But regardless, both of those are offshoots of a base Proto-Mesopotamian culture, right? Proto-Sumerian, let's say. So that Proto-Sumerian culture would have been Noah and his sons, which we might then say that Proto-Sumerian culture was, in fact, the original antediluvian culture.
Right.
So it would make sense that everyone would speak the same language because Noah and his sons weren't speaking different languages. They were communicating with one language.
Right.
That would have been the lingua franca from before the flood. And then as the populations grew, then you would have differentiation in the cultures that sprung out of the offspring of Noah.
Right.
And this is indeed what the biblical narrative describes. And so you would have all of these different cultures that are separating from one another and going and spreading out and going all over the earth, are carrying with them seeds of the original stories. And then those stories are becoming modified. There are cultural alterations happening. So that's why you would have so many stories that have many of the same features to them, but are variegated in regard to detail.
Right.
The names change, the number of people who survived the flood changes, the methodology by which they survived the flood changes, the gods who are involved in the story change.
They adapt it. They adapt it to their culture and to their needs, right?
Right. And because they're all carrying the seeds, they're all carrying the seeds of this story.
Right.
But the languages are different now. And they're becoming, there's distance now between it's the game of telephone, really. It's the original oral tradition is, as time goes on, is being altered in each culture.
Right.
And it's idiocentric to each culture. So you're going to have a cultural, you're going to have a different cultural flavor for each story because of that. So it only makes sense. It only makes sense that all of these different civilizations around the world are remembering the same event slightly differently.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
So there's an origin story. Now, you can choose to believe that origin story is the Sumerian account, or you can choose to believe that it's the biblical account, that it's the Noahic, that it's let's call it the account we have in the Old Testament, potentially written down by Moses, or you can believe that it is some other origin. But what you cannot deny is the the universality of the cataclysm mythos. There was a cataclysm. There's no question about it. There was a cataclysm. And again, because I adhere to the biblical narrative, subscribe to the biblical narrative, I believe that the origin of the story is indeed Noah, who came through the cataclysm and was preserving the oral traditions, probably also the certain manuscripts. He might even have had with him the Book of Enoch. It would have looked different than the one we have today, with some similarities, especially in the in the first two sections, the Book of the Watchers and the Book of Parables, which are the oldest. But Noah very well could have carried these important documents through the flood, as well as the oral tradition. And from that origin, you get all of the mythos all over the world.
Yeah, that's a really good point. We have no idea, other than the animals, what Noah took on the boat with him, right? Like, we typically have this picture, at least I did as a Christian growing up, that Noah's watching a line of animals coming into the boat, and then some drops of rain come out of the water, and then hurriedly in a burlap sack, he like runs into the boat, the door closes. We have no idea what he took. He could have taken pre-flood technology with him. He could have taken manuscripts, like you're saying, accounts of what. You don't think that they had written accounts before the flood?
Well, I tend to believe that as I said, the Book of Enoch was one of the first manuscripts ever written.
Really?
And it represents one of the very first pieces of literature ever penned by a member of the human species.
Really? Interesting.
And I do believe that Enoch authored the original manuscript. He was called, in the Book of Enoch, he's called a scribe. What do scribes do? They write, and they record. And so I think that the origin of writing goes way back into the past. Most conventional archaeologists and historians and anthropologists would say that it began sometime around 3300 BC, somewhere thereabout,
right, in
Mesopotamia, or somewhere in Egypt. Let's say the Fertile Crescent area, and that is what I believe that they are accurately. Well, perhaps not so accurately, but I think what they're all focusing on is not the beginning of these things, but a re-beginning.
Right.
To some extent, the re-beginning of disseminating writing and civilization and agriculture. It's the re-beginning.
Right.
After the cataclysm.
So they might be dating writing correctly, but that's the date of when writing first originated after the flood,
or when it became, or when the civilizations were robust enough, were maturated sufficiently to where they would be keeping records again. Because I don't believe that the flood happened. I used to believe it was around 3300 BC. That's where I would have placed the flood, maybe 8 years ago or so, or less actually. My view on this was already evolving when I wrote Birthright, but I probably would have placed it somewhere 33 or 3400 BC. But now I would push the flood back, as most people who've been following me know. I would push it back to 10,000 BC. So what you would have is, in the wake of the flood, you would have very primitive cultures arising, because everything has been destroyed. They have to start from square one.
Right.
So agriculture has to be reinitiated. But before you can do any of this on a large scale, you have to have a population. You have to have populations big enough to have cities, to make cities, to build.
Right.
And so that would take a long time. And it would take many hundreds, if not thousands of years to regain some of these arts of civilization, and rebuild civilization to some, perhaps only as a shadow of what it once was before the flood, almost certainly that's the case. So it would have taken a long time is the point. So when you factor in the cataclysm, then you have a different reckoning of the past. Now, if you factor in the cataclysm, you can now be in accord with what the ancients believed and still understand that much of what archaeologists are saying is true because they're recording a re-beginning, not the beginning.
Right.
And from that perspective, it makes sense. You can make a lot more sense of what you're discovering. You can make a lot more sense of Göbekli Tepe, for example. It makes sense why we see what appears to be these cultures that spring up out of nowhere. Like in the Egyptian culture, for example, the ancient Egyptians, there's really no record of them advancing from nothing, from hunter-gatherer people to this magnificent civilization. Well, that would make sense. You would not find that sort of evolutionary progression if the descendants of Noah had the knowledge from the pre-flood world. They had some of this knowledge and tradition, but they didn't have the populations yet to build, to do large-scale agriculture and to build large complexes and other sophisticated projects, aqueducts and temples and so forth. The knowledge would be there, but not the workforce. And so once the workforce is accumulated and the population is large enough and all of these different cultures get sequestered in their own territories, then suddenly they can start to rebuild and recreate some of what was, and recover some of what was lost in the pre-flood world, because they already have the knowledge. The legacy is there.
Yeah, they didn't have to learn it incrementally. They just needed to reproduce enough to execute on what they already knew.
It takes a population.
Yeah.
You cannot have a civilization cannot advance without a robust population. You need cities. You need governmental structures. You need armies. These things are necessary for the flourishment of civilization. And so even if you have the knowledge to build a great city, if you don't have the workforce, then that knowledge is just going to it's going to be collecting dust in the library of your brain.
Yeah.
Because you don't have the workforce. You simply do not have the resources, human resources that are required to go and harvest the natural resources in order to build the complexes.
Yeah.
And even to do other things, like even today we take for granted that, we have papers everywhere. We can get it easily. Paper took a lot of work to make. So writing and different forms of art were not nearly as easy as they are today, and they would not have been well preserved.
Yeah. One of my favorite arguments that I hear people make is, oh, why isn't there more art depicting the kinds of things you guys are describing, right? About this is in reference to like giants and the pre-flood world and stuff like that. And I'm like, well, post-flood, people weren't really like sitting around bored thinking about, I wonder how I could draw this landscape with that giant human over there. These guys were working the ground night to day. They were farming. They were surviving. They didn't have leisure time to develop their art abilities. You know what I mean?
They were surviving post-cataclysm. They were surviving in a world that was brutal.
Yeah.
Brutal. After the flood, that world would have been absolutely brutal.
Yeah.
It would not have been suddenly, all the forests are regrown. No. After this cataclysm, even if it was a local flood, okay, the entire planet was subjected to cataclysm.
Right.
So it would have taken a long time to recover. The wildlife, the populations of the animals alone would take time to rebuild, to get reestablished.
Right.
The different biological environments on Earth, the biomes would take time to regrow, and it would be a hellscape.
Yeah.
Really, I mean,
Wasteland.
post cataclysm, whether you believe it was a global flood or a local flood or a global cataclysm, as I believe, but localized flooding, but a global cataclysm. When I say localized, I mean mass flooding all over the place, all over the coasts of every continent and the rivers, but not every square inch of the ground covered in water. That would be my position. But the entire Earth subject to extreme cataclysm.
Right.
It would be, as I said, it would be a hellscape, and it would be a very, very difficult environment to survive in, and it would require, human beings would have to begin again, and would have to be that family structure would have to be very tightly knit, and all of the effort would be on survival, and it would be difficult. So it would be a very slow process of starting over. It's not just going to pop up again in 100 years.
Right.
It's going to take centuries.
Yeah.
And it's going to take thousands of years, in my estimation, for the great civilizations to appear after the flood. They're not going to pop up overnight.
Right.
And even though, as I said before, the knowledge was there, it was not enough of it, not all of it, but enough of the knowledge from the pre-flood world, from the antediluvian world, was preserved by Noah and his sons. If you subscribe to the biblical narrative, as I do, and even if you don't, if you subscribe to some other narrative, it's still the same. The fact remains that knowledge would have been preserved to some extent.
Right.
And waiting for civilization to grow, for the population to grow large enough to implement the knowledge. And this is, I think, what we actually see in the archaeological record. Why is it? Where did the legacy come from? Where did the civilization come from? The Sumerians and the Akkadians kind of pop out of nowhere.
Right.
The ancient Egyptians pop out of nowhere. Where did this knowledge come from? It's clearly a legacy. And I think we can believe their accounts, which is the legacy comes from the old world that was destroyed in Cataclysm. So that's a very different view. I think it is the correct archaeological, historical view. And if you're working from that view, you can make a lot more sense of what we observe in regard to the remains of the megaliths, for example. We can make a lot more sense of it. If we reject uniformitarianism and revert back to what I would view as the correct doctrine, which is catastrophism.
Yeah. It kind of is the only theory, right, that makes sense and that removes a ton of holes in the modern narrative. One of which you keep bringing up, and I've only learned this in the past 3 years or so, that the current narrative is monkeys evolved to cavemen or whatever, in the cave rubbing sticks for fire, then to hunter-gatherers, then to Sumerians, Egyptians, advanced civilization. There's no record of advancement from the hunter-gatherer to the Egyptian civilization.
Right, that's right. There's a missing link, just like in the evolutionary theory. There's a missing link.
Yeah, there's no building. We started with stick houses to mud huts to stone houses to pyramids. There isn't that trajectory. There is hunter-gatherers and teepees, okay, to Egyptian pyramids.
That's right.
Where's the in-between?
Exactly. And this is a question that historians and archaeologists really struggle to answer. But the answer is apparent. They tell you. These cultures tell you
right
where the legacy came from.
Yeah, but Tim, they're dumb. They're just making stuff up.
They're stupid. These are ignorant. Yeah, right. Exactly. So this is the problem with the Darwinian perspective of the historical narrative,
bigger,
of the
better,
timeline
stronger.
of history. We have this ridiculous inverse idea, inverse in regard to the reality, that are, the further we go back in time, the more ignorant our ancestors become.
Right.
Whereas in reality, and this is what the biblical narrative conveys, and I think also what people who've spent time studying and going out in the field and looking at, for example, I'll reference again the megaliths, which are just absolutely superior to any masonry we have today. We'll realize very quickly that our antecedents were brilliant, and that they knew things that we have forgotten,
right,
and that they must have been much more intelligent than we give them credit for. And that's the correct view, the historical narrative. The further you go back in time, that timeline, the further you go back in time, the more intelligent the human species becomes.
So it's the opposite of the Darwinian
view. That is the correct narrative. So if you plug that in, that our antecedents were far more extraordinary than we give them credit for, and that there was a cataclysm. So you plug in the catastrophism, and you understand that our antecedents were magnificently intelligent and physically robust. Then everything fits together. Everything we find, you don't have to obfuscate archaeological artifacts that don't fit the Darwinian uniformitarian paradigm of history, because that's what archaeologists do. I've seen them do it myself. I've witnessed this in Peru. If there's an artifact that's discovered that belays the accepted historical narrative about the Incan Empire, then that artifact is just kind of intentionally lost and forgotten about. It's boxed up and put on the shelf in some back room somewhere in a museum. This is the problem when you have an intellectual community entrenched in a particular doctrine, in a doctrine. Their entire world, their financial sustenance, their credibility,
all of it,
their job opportunities, everything in their ecosystem, whether they're an archaeologist, an anthropologist, a historian, it only works if they adhere to the narrative.
Right.
They can only survive in that ecosystem if they're supporting the narrative. As soon as you have somebody that begins to pull the thread on another narrative and begins to find evidence that, hey, we've got this wrong, that person is ostracized. So you have this, as I said, you have this entrenched intelligentsia as it pertains to the narrative of history, and they have adopted, they're hamstrung with the Darwinian uniformitarian historical timeline.
Right.
They've hamstrung themselves with this. And so this is the situation that we have now, and they simply cannot accept that our antecedents were as magnificent as they were. They will say the ancient Egyptians were a magnificent culture, but as you progress further back down the timeline, you end up with the Flintstones in their perspective, which is absurd.
So Flintstones to Egyptians.
That's not what the evidence indicates.
Yeah.
The evidence indicates that we have profound knowledge the further you go back in time. Profound knowledge related to astronomy, related to mathematics, related to a host of scientific inquiries. You have profound knowledge that is evident in the deep past. In fact, the ancient Egyptians, who we think were so magnificent, and they look back to their antecedents with awe. They look back with longing to the achievements of the antediluvian world. Everything that these post-flood cultures were doing was trying to regain some vestige of the glory, of the magnificence of their antecedents, of their antediluvian antecedents. Every single major culture, even in the Inca in Peru, every major culture, every primary culture on Earth is looking back into the world before the cataclysm with longing, and reverence, because they knew that the achievements of the past were greater than their own achievements. And part of that has to do with the fact that they also knew that much of those achievements were the result of man intermingling with the gods in the world before the great cataclysm. And so that knowledge was bequeathed to mankind. It was the Promethean fire. And so you see this, what you see is a record of the human species trying to regain the glory of the antediluvian world, some vestige of the glory of the antediluvian world. That is the correct narrative. That's it.
Right.
And again, when you plug that in, when you plug in the cataclysm and you plug in the superiority, the mental and physical superiority of our antecedents, then everything makes sense.
It's the only thing that makes sense and removes all of the holes in the narrative. And I think that's why you're starting to see a shift in kind of the mainstream, or people that are breaking into the mainstream, right? Most popular podcaster, Joe Rogan, multiple episodes with Graham Hancock and Randall Carlson, who none of those three are believers, and all of them give pretty dang good arguments for like the biblical account of the flood and the antediluvian world with its advancement. Hancock,
they would not, Hancock and Carlson would probably not affirm the biblical narrative.
Not
but they
the
would
biblical
affirm,
narrative.
They would affirm that collective tradition.
Yeah, of catastrophism and of a golden age.
They do affirm.
And of a golden age.
And of a golden age.
Right?
That's right. Yeah.
So just because they don't read it from the Bible, but get it from everywhere outside the Bible, it's like, hey, we've been saying this for a few thousand years. You guys are just now catching up, And so Hancock will talk about the golden age in terms of Atlantis. Okay.
Right. He views it through a laudatory prism. And that's the way that most of the ancient, nearly all of the ancient cultures viewed the golden age, through a laudatory prism. In other words, they saw it as this wonderful time of peace and prosperity. What makes the Hebrew account unique is that they have their view is the antithesis. They view the antediluvian world as a time of great transgression and rebellion and bloodshed, and it was unbridled immorality, and that man's interaction with the gods did not result in something positive. Rather, it resulted in something. It resulted in something terrifying. The offspring of the gods, the giants, who were devouring mankind, and the knowledge that was given to us, that Promethean fire. It was like giving children matches to play with in a dry field. The technology and the knowledge defiled mankind. So rather than going through this time of great enlightenment and peace and prosperity during the golden age, when the gods, and really the offspring of gods, governed the earth, from the Hebrew perspective, it was a nightmare.
Wow. And
it was a dystopia, and that's a stark contradiction to most of the other accounts of the golden age.
And that's a unique perspective to the to what do you call it, to the Abrahamic religions.
Yeah, and you can find there are some traditions that would view the golden age as more of a dystopia, but it's rare. It's rare. In fact, I struggle to think of any at all. The Inca believed that one of their origin myths was that the god Viracocha, the first creation of Viracocha, was a race of giants. But those giants were evil and stupid, and so he destroyed them with a flood.
Wow.
So, however, the Inca also believed that they were descended from the gods, and that the gods had inhabited the earth and built these wonderful things, and that's why they re-inhabited the what they would have viewed as the residue, the ruins of the empire of the gods,
right,
at Cusco, at Machu Picchu, at Ollantaytambo, the megalithic foundations,
right,
of the handiwork of the gods. So they had sort of a dual perspective. They had one mythos of evil, stupid giants who were destroyed in the flood, but then on the other hand, they're the offspring of the gods who inhabited the earth, and that's their legacy.
Right.
So, but by far the most detailed reckoning of the antediluvian world in regard to it being a dystopia, a nightmarish dystopia, is the Hebrew account. And when I say the Hebrew account, I'm talking about primarily the account that comes from the book of Enoch.
Really?
Because if you look in the Old Testament, you're going to find references to the story that is recorded in the book of Enoch, and indeed direct quotes.
Not to deter from this conversation, but obviously you're pulling a lot from the book of Enoch and you're referencing it often. Why do you think the book of Enoch wasn't incorporated into the canon?
Oh, that's a complicated. The answer to that question
I don't want to deter,
is
but
complicated.
I just want a brief like opinion.
Okay, so the short answer for why the book of Enoch didn't make the canon is Augustine, rather. He had a very negative view of the book of Enoch, in contrast to many of the other early church fathers, and especially Tertullian, who argued for its inclusion in the scriptures, in the canon. So the book of Enoch was very widely distributed I believe that if you were to go back to the time of Christ and you were to go into the synagogues of the Jews located throughout Judea, and also in some of the Greek cities, you would find a copy of the book of Enoch. Not the one we have today. It would be different, but you would find a manuscript that was purporting to be either the record that was written from the oral tradition of Enoch, or a direct copy of the manuscript that was penned by the hand of Enoch.
Right.
The reason why the primary reason is because it was rejected by certain figures within the Catholic Church. And the reason why their objection to the book of Enoch held so much sway was because it was also rejected in the Jewish canon. Right. And the reason why it was rejected in the Jewish canon is very clear. And this Tertullian actually makes this argument. It was rejected because of the messianic prophecies that clearly pointed to Jesus of Nazareth.
Really?
That was the primary reason why the Jews rejected it. And that's apparent when you read the parables, for example. It's apparent. The early church was conversant with Enoch. The New Testament, some of the New Testament writers, such as Peter and Jude, reference it directly. Jude records it verbatim in the book of Jude. Peter makes a direct reference to to the Book of Enoch in regard to an incident that's only found in the Book of Enoch.
Wow.
The details of an incident. And so it's apparent that the apostles in the early church were conversant with Enoch. Now, whether it should be in the canon or whatever, to me, that's irrelevant. The only question I'm interested in is are portions of the Book of Enoch historically accurate? And I believe they are. Now, the Book of Enoch as a whole is a very complex, convoluted document. It's not one singular author, and it's not all published at the same date. Clearly, the latter portions of First Enoch, which is the Ethiopic Enoch, have a Second Temple Merkaba mysticism influence, and in my opinion are therefore unreliable. But the first sections of Enoch, the Book of the Watchers and the Book of Parables, I think are authentic and either represent some sort of a recopying of an early manuscript or the record of an oral tradition that goes back to Enoch.
Okay, cool. Yeah, I didn't mean to deter. It's just you were bringing it up a lot. Being like a pretty normal vanilla Christian, I didn't have exposure to the Book of Enoch. So most people, when you bring it up, they're like, hey, that's not in the Bible. Why does this guy keep talking about it? So as long as you've got an opinion and reasons why you think it is a valid source, I'm interested, you know? If it was just like, just because it says so, then I'm like, hold on a second. But there's a lot of people that don't believe in the Book of Enoch. So I want to hear.
Well, it doesn't matter what people do or don't believe in.
That's
the question
true.
is, did the ancient Hebrews believe in the Enochian tale? And the answer is unequivocally, yes, they did.
That's very true.
The lore that you have in the Book of Enoch, it was all ancient Hebrews were conversant with the story of Enoch. All ancient Hebrews. It was a part of their tradition.
Yeah.
And it underlies so much of their theology.
Very true, Tim.
The cosmology of the ancient Hebrews, to some extent, hinges on the Enochian tale, and you cannot remove Enoch. You cannot remove Enoch from the Old Testament, and we have, in regard to our understanding of our perspective of the Old Testament. That's why we have these mysterious, weird things that don't make any sense, such as the Genesis 6 affair. But when you allow the Enochian tale to inform our reading of the Old Testament, it makes perfect sense. You can understand why certain details are there, why certain things are not elaborated, and so forth. I'm getting ready to publish very soon. I'll be publishing my own version, not my own version. It's the R.H. Charles version of the Book of Enoch, but it's with my own introduction and commentary.
Cool.
And I'm doing this in conjunction with Luke Rogers and Nate Henry from Blurry Creatures. So we're doing a what do you call it? A collaboration on the Book of Enoch, and I'm really excited for that because I wrote a very detailed introduction to the Book of Enoch, and commentary that you probably won't read anywhere else. In fact, I've never read a commentary on the Book of Enoch, so it's the commentary that I wrote is coming from my own reading through the Book of Enoch, and my own perspective on it, but. We also have, it's very unique because we also have, we're going to have illustrations, some conceptual scenes rather, and text describing a particular perspective, a unique perspective on those scenes.
Very cool.
And people will understand what I mean when they get the book in their hands. That's not available yet, but it will be coming available soon.
Yeah.
It's something we've been working on, and we're getting ready to release in the coming month.
Okay. Yeah. Let me know when that's available. Super curious about that. And I want to share it with our audience in case they're more interested in learning about this, because I definitely am. I think we often forget that Old Testament and New Testament wasn't written directly to me and to you in 2024. It was written to a certain group of people who had a certain worldview, existed in a particular culture, a time and place in history. And so if the words in the Bible fell on deaf ears because it was culturally irrelevant, it wouldn't have served a very good purpose. So if the early Jewish culture had the Book of Enoch and they understood it as maybe historic or of cultural relevance, then of course mentions of it or references to and allusions to the Book of Enoch should make themselves known in other letters. Like you said, Jude and Peter, they reference it because the original audience would have known exactly what they're talking about.
That's right. Even Jesus references the Book of Enoch directly. He doesn't say, this is written in the Book of Enoch, but he clearly references the narrative on several occasions. So it's you cannot strip the Enochian tale out of the Bible, both Old and New Testament. You can't. It's there. It's part of the cosmology of the ancient Hebrews, and it's foundational to the eschatology of the apostles of Christ in the New Testament. Foundational. Absolutely foundational. So it is what it is, and regardless of whether or not it's in a canon or not, that's irrelevant.
Right.
It's irrelevant. It is part of Hebrew cosmology. It's the foundation of much of Hebrew cosmology.
Right.
Whether people like that or not, it makes no difference.
Okay, fair. Okay, before I deterred, you were saying that the Hebrew perspective of the Golden Age is somewhat unique in that it's like catastrophic. It's not something to strive towards or for, but it's interesting because in a lot of the modern perspectives, like I listen to Hancock, I listen to this other guy once in a while called Billy Carson or Matt LaCroix, if you've ever heard of these guys.
Yeah, I'm familiar with all of those gentlemen.
Okay, they put out a certain opinion that this golden age, right, before the catastrophe, this is something to strive for and something that we need to aim towards. And then it's curious that it gets tied into kind of this new age spirituality thing, okay? And it's as if they want to bring that era back into or back to us now. But it's the Hebrew account or the biblical account that says, no, you don't want that to happen again.
Well, we need to be specific here.
Yeah.
We need to parse this correctly because
please.
The antediluvian age was remarkable, and it is to be admired in regard to, as I said earlier, the exceptional capabilities and caliber of our antecedents, of our antediluvian antecedents. So I think there's much to be said for the knowledge and and certainly the culture of the antediluvian world, because don't forget, we're not just talking about a bunch of immoral, bloodthirsty maniacs. That comes later. We're talking about the prototype of the human species, Adam and Eve, and their offspring, who would have been magnificent. And so when I look into the antediluvian world, I have a sense of awe and terror. Awe at our antediluvian antecedents, Adam and his offspring, and terror is probably not the right word. Maybe shock and astonishment at how debauched they became and bloodthirsty, murderous, that the world became before the cataclysm. Even the Atlantean account conveys this. The Atlanteans became very militaristic and aggressive towards their neighbors, and they became very arrogant. This is part of the Atlantean lore, as told by Plato.
Oh, Hancock doesn't
so
talk
even the
about
Atlantean
that.
account records this. And so I think the earlier generations of the antediluvian age are to be, as I said, to be admired. But what ultimately happened was disastrous, and it was the interference, it was the interaction with extraterrestrial beings. In the Book of Enoch, those beings were the Watchers, and the chaos that was wrought by their hybrid offspring that led to and really catalyzed the extreme immorality that preceded the flood of Noah, that preceded the cataclysm. So I would not ever want to revive what I call the empire of the gods. The empire of the gods, in which the gods walked openly among men, cohabitated with them, copulated with our females, and procreated hybrid demigods. That's a bad idea. And in fact, I think that is coming at the end of the age. That's part of the conclusion of my book. So I think we are going to see a repeat of that, a Genesis 6 2.0, if you will. I would never advocate that sort of activity.
Right.
But what I desire to some extent, to emulate the magnificence of our antediluvian antecedents. Yes, absolutely. I think that we're all, to some extent, trying to be Adam again.
Right.
And, he represents the pinnacle of the human species.
Yeah, and arguably, I mean, the end of our book, the end of the Bible, is a new heaven, new earth, right? With humanity reestablished. Arguably, the Adamic order is reestablished.
Well, it's more than that. The human species, those who merit the resurrection through faith in Christ, are going to be reset to the blueprint of Adam.
Exactly.
Genetically reset to the original blueprint of the human species. We're going to be more human at the resurrection than we are now.
Yeah.
Because we are.
Yeah, that's good.
We are mutants. We have degenerated.
Man, that's the opposite of the Darwinian perspective. Well,
the Darwinian perspective is the Darwinian / uniformitarian perspective is indeed the antithesis of reality. And I think many people are realizing that now, that, you don't have to abandon the idea of adaptation and microevolution. You can hold on to the idea of adaptation and microevolution, which makes sense,
of course,
but yet completely abandon the theory of evolution by natural selection, the evolutionary history of humanity. You can completely abandon that because it's absurd.
Right.
It does not conform to reality. When I say microevolution, I know this is, this is a huge digression, and we got like 3 minutes left. But when I say microevolution adaptation, I'm talking about the action of a virus, for example, that when it's in an organism adapts to be able to continue to infect that organism as that organism is upgrading its defenses. That's an adaptive property.
Right.
That does not by any means confirm macroevolution, that a shrew can become,
of course,
an elephant can become a human being or something like that.
Yeah.
That is a logical leap. That is quite illogical, actually. It's an illogical leap.
Yeah.
That can be jettisoned at this point. We can jettison that ridiculous notion and understand that what we're witnessing in in the world is indeed the opposite. We are witnessing the devolution of the human species, not the evolution of the human species, it's the devolution of the human species. And by the way, of other species as well.
That's good.
That's evident in nature. It's evident. It's as evident in nature as the fact that our antecedents were better masons than we are. Just look at the megaliths. That's all you need. You don't need any other information except for the remains of what they built.
Right.
And you can say, okay, they were better at building than we are today, at least as it pertains to these cyclopean anti-seismic walls they were building.
Right.
So it's and this is a good way to sort of summarize and conclude, is if we amended our Darwinian uniformitarian historical timeline, if we amended it and we had the correct view, and we jettison this idea that the further you go back in time, you start from where we are today as these highly intelligent human beings who have all this technology. We're so great, and our antecedents were dumb, and start from where we are and retrograde on the timeline all the way to the Flintstones. That's garbage. That is
right.
Garbage, and everybody knows. And I say everybody in this community knows that's ridiculous. So if you were to just get rid of that and plug in the right perspective, which is that we as human beings are shadows of Adam, that we have genetically degenerated, that both intellectually and physically speaking, we are, we're mutants. We're X-Men, but not in the good way. We don't have any superpowers.
Right.
We haven't gained any superpowers through our mutation. Indeed, we've lost the extraordinary capabilities of our antediluvian antecedents to a great extent. And then you extrapolate that out in regard to civilization, and you understand that when you go back into the past and you see these magnificent monuments, such as the Great Pyramids at Giza, you realize that this is a legacy from an even greater civilization that was suddenly and abruptly destroyed in Cataclysm, and that all of these cultures and civilizations are trying to emulate and regain the knowledge and the glory of their antecedents, of their antediluvian antecedents. Then everything makes sense.
Right.
Everything makes sense.
It's the only way.
The cancer epidemic makes sense. Even everything makes sense.
Yeah.
And I think increasingly people are waking up to the absurdity of the uniformitarian Darwinian perspective of history, geologic and human.
I don't think it's coincidental that as people are waking up more and more to the reality of our past, and at the same time, people are calling for this rekindling of a golden age, that we're starting to see funky things appearing in the sky, and more of these UFO, UAP, alien disclosure, all that kind of crap happening. I don't think that's coincidental. I think that as the human consciousness becomes more accepting of these things or these concepts, I don't think that the demonic or the evil has any problem making itself known and giving humanity what it's asking for, which is what they did in the antediluvian era, right?
Well, again, that's part of the narrative of my book, and that's very, very interesting. And I'll say it again, a complex.
Yeah.
That would be a very complex discussion because there's a lot unfolding now that is directing us toward another golden age and the advent of the gods walking among men and all of that. But that takes a long time to unpack.
I know, man.
We're out of time.
Yeah, we had an hour and some change with Tim. I literally asked, let's have some extra biblical evidence, and it took an hour because it's so rich and so dense. I got to point two on my outline here of 35.
Well, we can come back and continue the rest of your outline.
I knew this would happen, Tim. I knew that once we get started, it's so rich that I don't want to be like, okay, cool. So let's go to the next point. I want these things to be flushed out thoroughly, because all of these things compound. They build on each other to make a holistic argument, you know? So, Tim, thank you for your time. I want to respect it. If we could do this again, maybe we'll get to question 3 next time. And I hope you guys learned something. I sure did. Go ahead, Tim.
I was going to say, if I may, these kind of discussions, I'm really excited about this new enterprise that I've started called the Alberino Analysis Members Community.
Ooh.
It's a subscription-based membership community. You can go to the alberinoanalysis.com if you want to subscribe. And these are the kind of conversations and topics that we're really diving deep into. It's a community of people who want to learn more about this stuff and interface with each other and interface with me. And there's a lot of things that are happening there. I have 3 films, by the way, 3 films that are available only to the annual subscribers that I've been working on for several years. These are television quality productions. Indeed, they are. It is a television show in progress.
Wow.
In production. And my annual members, if you go and subscribe for an annual membership at the alberinoanalysis.com, you're going to get a complimentary viewing of these 3 episodes.
Nice.
Which deal with a lot of the topics we've been talking about, actually, megaliths, and we did a DNA analysis on the Procas elongated skulls, and we discovered a lost city in the Andes called Tauripunku, and it's a lot of adventure, and a lot of this content that we've been discussing is in those episodes of that TV series. So
I'll definitely link all that down below. I'm going to be part of that community, guaranteed. So if you see me in there chatting away, the other cool thing about what you're doing, Tim, especially taking it to this extent, because not too many people do, you're countering the narrative that's being put out there by a lot of these mainstream guys at this point, like we were talking about earlier today, some of those characters, and you're giving a more sound and more obviously biblical explanation of the same events, the same details, the same evidences, but you're gearing people in the right direction versus just, hey, let's reconnect with the demonic forces that once led humanity into a golden era that ended in their destruction, So I commend you on that, and I hope this plays a part in that and what we did here. Hopefully we could do it again and get to question 3.
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks for having me on, and we'll have to continue this conversation at a later date.
Sounds good, Tim. I appreciate it, buddy.